This, okay. After this talk, if you guys are interested in sticking around, we'll be talking a little bit about a community science project that we're doing involving the yellow rails, surveying them here and kind of seeing when they're moving into this area and when they leave. So if you're interested in participating in that, stick around afterwards. We'll be doing another little talk about that and kind of talking about how to do those survey information. So doing a little plug for my program after this. But yeah, so Jesse used to work at the Nature Center, but he's been studying herps in our waterways for, oh gosh, no, I don't know.
Officially, 2017.
In 2017, so quite a while. So he is kind of our regional expert in the local herps. So I'm very excited to hear all about what he's going to talk to us. Looks like native, invasive, and everything in between. So what's local, what's not, and everything in between. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Jesse. Here's your open microphone.
Right. So, who am I? My name is Jesse Short. I'm a biologist and herpetologist locally here in Bend and Central Oregon in general. I grew up here, born and raised in Bend, and have always had an interest in reptiles and amphibians ever since I was yay big, and I have a photo of me with a garter snake in each hand and a big smile on my face as one of my earliest photos. Um, what do I do? I run Central Oregon Habitat Solutions with my business partner, Julia Katz, and we do surveys of Oregon spotted frog habitat, checking on the populations. We do habitat restoration. We do bullfrog removal. We do beaver habitat restoration and beaver dam analogs, all that kind of thing. Just basically anything in and around our Central Oregon waterways and making sure that we keep our wildlife and vegetation healthy and happy and still around for our kids and their grandkids and so on and so forth. My background is I was actually homeschooled up until the end of high school, and I went to Central Oregon Community College and then off to OSU in Corvallis, going after a natural resources degree, and then jumped into a job here in Sunriver doing bullfrog management for an environmental consulting firm based out of Portland. And that guy that I was working for, his name's Eric, great guy, but he was looking to retire, and so I started my own gig, and he transferred some of those contracts over to me, and then I ran with the ball, and that's where I am now. So it was 2017, so this is year 8 of doing bullfrog removal in Sunriver. So what is herpetology and why is it important? So herpetology is the study of reptiles and amphibians, otherwise called herps. Um, they're not actually all that close in the tree of life. You've got birds in there somewhere, but they're the root word means creeping creature, and so they kind of got lumped together because frogs and snakes and lizards and all, they all just kind of crawl around on the ground, and birds don't really fit that description. So they, even though they're not lumped together, they still get their own word. Um, and why are they important? Herps are a key indicator of ecosystem health. And so, especially with something like frogs, they have very permeable skin. And so, if you've got some contaminant in the water, they're going to absorb that right through their skin, and you're going to see it pretty quick in the frog population if you've got something bad going on. An example is the serious decline in many species due to chytrid fungus, and over 500 species worldwide have decreased over the last like 50 years, I believe, and it's caused the extinction of more than 90 species. And then fun fact, frogs were among the first animals to be affected by global declines in biodiversity, and biodiversity is just the amount of species in an area. So you want kind of as many native species in your area as possible because they all kind of lean on each other and keep each other going. And so herpetologists were some of the first scientists to raise the alarm about worldwide ecosystem problems because they saw the frogs declining or disappearing completely and raised the alarm. So Here's some of our native species. These are all species associated with the waterways of Central Oregon. Not all of them are real common. So rough-skinned newt, you're only going to find it in a couple of lakes, kind of in the north side of Central Oregon. You'll see these guys all over the place. You can see them right here at the Nature Center crawling around in the warm sunlight in the spring. These guys are only found in a small pocket in Bend and a little bit south of Bend. Cascades frogs are found up in the high Cascades. Got the Oregon spotted frog here in Sunriver, and there's a small population in Bend as well, but mostly Sunriver and farther upstream in the Deschutes Basin. They've got the long-toed salamander. They're all over the place. The northwestern salamander is again up in the high Cascades and some of the lakes. Western toad, that's a very green one, so they don't always look like that. But that's from right here in Lake Aspen at the Nature Center. And they're also all throughout Central Oregon. And then wandering garter snake is kind of from Bend lower in elevation. So you'll find them out along the Crooked River and along the lower Deschutes. So the Oregon spotted frog is one of our four focus species today. They're federally threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And they were listed in 2014 because biologists had found that they were declining range-wide. They ranged historically from Northern California all the way up into British Columbia. And now there's a very small population in British Columbia, and they're extirpated from California completely. So they're only found in Oregon, Washington, and a tiny bit of Canada now. They're declining because of climate change, invasive species, habitat loss, habitat degradation, and water management. Water management is kind of a tricky issue here in Central Oregon because you've got farmers and ranchers that need water for their crops and to be able to keep themselves afloat in this world. And so they have water rights that give them permission to take X amount of water from the river to water all their crops. And there's room for ranchers and for the frog, but because the frog is federally listed under the Endangered Species Act, it gets protections and there's limits on what they can or can't do with their water. And so that's been a big issue in Central Oregon in the last 10 years. And isn't one that's going to go away anytime soon. But luckily, we've been piping a lot of the canals, and so we don't have to take as much water out of the Deschutes to be able to water all those crops to the extent that they need. And we used to lose about 60% of the water that we pulled out of the river to leakage into the ground or evaporation from the open canals. So steps like that are making a big difference for the spotted frog. Here's some other photos of spotted frogs. This is an Oregon spotted frog trying to mate with a bullfrog. And so different species of frogs have different release calls, as they're called. And so if a spotted frog grabs onto another spotted frog, if it's two males, because they'll just grab anything when they're in the spawning mood. And so if one male grabs another male, the other male will make his release call, which is kind of a sound, and then that male that grabbed him will let go because he knows this isn't the female I was looking for. But if he grabs onto a bullfrog, which is a non-native species, that bullfrog doesn't speak spotted frog because he evolved on the East Coast and now he's here. And so that spotted frog was likely holding on to that bullfrog for days or even weeks because that bullfrog didn't know the language and how to say, let go of me, I'm not a female. So this is where they used to range, all the red up around Portland and Corvallis, up in Upper Washington. And all that red is where they're now extirpated, no longer occur. And then the yellow is what's called designated critical habitat. That's what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided is the most important habitat where they occur and need to be protected. And so that includes everything from Bend up past Lake Billy Chinook, or not Lake Billy Chinook, up past Wikiup Reservoir, and all throughout the Little Deschutes Basin as well. So what do you do to manage a native species when it's having issues? I recommend the scientific method. So you've got your observation, your question, your hypothesis, your experiment, your analysis, and your conclusion. So with an observation, you're surveying and monitoring the spotted frog population, trying to figure out, are they in trouble? Are they fine? And then depending on what you get from those surveys and monitoring efforts, you come up with a question of why could the population be declining? And then you build your hypothesis. There's too many bullfrogs. So with that hypothesis, then you can test that hypothesis with an experiment, like removing the bullfrogs, and then analyze your data. So did removing the bullfrogs help the population? With removing the bullfrogs from a pond, did I see an increase in the spotted frogs there? If there is, then great. And the conclusion is fewer bullfrogs means more spotted frogs. And the nice thing about the scientific method is that you don't have to do one experiment or all of your focus. You don't have to put all your focus on one experiment. You can have several different hypotheses going at the same time, as long as they don't mess each other up. And that way you're not spending years testing one hypothesis only to find out that was the wrong hypothesis and then moving on to the next one. So with a nice big area like Sunriver, you can kind of separate it into subregions and then test hypotheses in different areas and see what's working best. Invasive species. So here we've got a bullfrog and then a red-eared slider. Red-eared sliders, they're present in Central Oregon, but they're not really an issue right now. This is one that I removed from the old mill in Bend. They could survive potentially, but they're not really adapted well to our climate. It's very hot and dry in the summer and then cold and snowy in the winter. And so they don't overwinter all that well. They usually come out of hibernation really thin and unable to reproduce that following year. And so they may kind of boom and bust is what it's called. So they, let's say someone released their pair of red-eared sliders. Those two could lay eggs that summer, and then you'd have eggs and baby turtles that fall. And then the next spring, you may have some of those babies surviving. But overall, they're not really doing any real damage, and they're not surviving long enough to reproduce in Central Oregon. The bullfrogs, on the other hand, they're all over the state of Oregon, all the way over to Idaho, all the way over to the coast, and they're extremely invasive. An adult bullfrog like that one can eat a small western pond turtle or painted turtles. They'll eat adult Oregon spotted frogs. Anything that they can fit in their mouth, they'll swallow it, and they can digest bone and shell and all sorts of stuff. So they're pretty difficult to get rid of because a single pair of bullfrogs can lay up to 20,000 eggs in a season. And so if you have a survival rate of, say, 10%, that's still quite a few frogs. So they were introduced back in the 1900s. Some of the introductions were intentional as a means of biomass production. So what do you see as a healthy ecosystem is something that has lots of wildlife, right? But if you put bullfrogs in there, your lots of wildlife is all one species. And so they tend to produce a lot of frogs. And when they get to their maximum density, adults are mostly eating smaller bullfrogs, and they just eat everything else out of the pond. And the reason that that becomes an issue is if, let's say, you have a pond with a bunch of different species, you get a bullfrog in there, two bullfrogs in there, and they take over, they eat all the other frogs, all the other amphibians, all the snakes, all that stuff, then all you have is your vegetation, your bullfrogs, and then any fish. And then let's say you get something like reed canary grass, which is a very invasive weed. It'll outcompete all the vegetation around your pond, leaving you with just grass and just bullfrogs. And then let's say you get something like carp in there. They'll outcompete all the other fish until there's nothing left but carp, reed canary grass, and bullfrogs. And then if you have some sort of disease come through and it kills the reed canary grass, then all of a sudden there's no cover for the bullfrogs, there's no food for the carp, and you're left with an empty mud flat that nothing can survive in. And so biodiversity, everything kind of has evolved together and works together to create an ecosystem that works and can take diseases or the occasional invasive species that isn't as bad as bullfrogs typically, and they can adapt and continue on. They were also introduced as pest control because a lot of people don't want bugs around their ponds, and they're a good way of doing that. They were unintentionally introduced in shipments of fish, so goldfish for people's ponds or koi or that kind of thing. People would get an order from the East Coast and put it in their pond, and that would have a couple of tadpoles, and those would turn into bullfrogs, and then you've got a whole population in a couple of years. They were also released pets. Oftentimes, people would get a tadpole at the pet store and raise it up until it was a frog. And then when it's a frog that size and it doesn't fit in their little aquarium, they'd take it out and let it go in the pond, and that's how you get bullfrogs. They were even stocked as a game fish by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife back in the early 1900s. So they have gotten here in all sorts of different ways. And what do you do to manage an invasive species? So you do your surveys, find out where they are, where they need to be removed from, do manual or passive removal. I typically go out by kayak with a net or by walking around in waders and catching them by hand. Most I've gotten in a night was a two-man crew in about 4 hours. We got 1,027 bullfrogs. So when they get dense in an area, they get really dense in an area. At that point, you're getting, two, sometimes three at a time in your grabs. So after that, do restoration designed to benefit, in this case, spotted frogs over the bullfrogs. So bullfrogs like having relatively open habitat where they can lunge out and grab something bigger to eat rather than going for little flies or something like that. Spotted frogs like the more dense vegetation where they don't have to be out in the open as much, and they can eat the little insects and smaller frogs. They'll eat little tree frogs and stuff as well. And so encouraging the ecosystem to be more dense with the vegetation will help with eliminating the bullfrogs. And then continued surveys to make sure that they don't come back, and removing any that do before they can spawn. And with red-eared sliders, doing surveys, doing the removal, and then continuing surveys to make sure that they don't come back is sufficient. These are some photos of bullfrog removal. This one's still got his tail. He's just starting to come up onto land. So human-assisted native species. This one's kind of a tricky one. So this is a western pond turtle. They're currently under review for listing under the Endangered Species Act, and they have been since 2015. So they're declining range-wide. They've actually been split into two species now, the southern and the northern. The southern is found in Southern California, and then the Pacific is the northern one, but Pacific is found all the way up into Canada. They locally were introduced around the 1970s. ODFW, anytime that they got a quote unquote unreleasable turtle from a confiscation or something like that, they would release it into the Deschutes River because it was better than euthanizing it. And if they didn't know where it came from, or if they didn't know if it had diseases or something like that, then they didn't want to risk putting it back into an established population where it could tank that population or cause it to go extinct. They are native to Oregon. They make it about to the mouth of the Deschutes on the east side, going north, and then they're in the Klamath Basin. One question I like to ask people is, how should this population be treated if they receive the threatened status under the Endangered Species Act? Because it's a native species that's protected elsewhere, but it's artificially put there. And so do we protect it? Do we put restrictions on the landowners that have those turtles on their property? What do we do? So I'll have another question at the end to think about. But there's some more photos. That's a little hatchling on his way to the river for the first time. And then that's an adult. This is the range. So just barely into Canada up there, and then up along the west side of the Cascades. All right, human-assisted native species with a question mark. So tiger salamanders nobody knows how they got to Sunriver. They could be what's called a relict population, where they have occurred here forever, or forever in terms of our presence in the area. Um, or they could be the result of a bait bucket dump. They used to be used a lot as fishing bait, and so people would oftentimes dump out their bucket when they were done fishing. And if they had any live salamander larvae in there, then those larvae could go on and inhabit the area. They, yeah, like I said, they could be native, but it would require genetic testing to know for sure, and nobody's done that yet. So that's one of the things on my list to do in the next 10 years or so is get the funding to get some genetics run and figure out if they should be here or if they are just a bucket dump. Here's some other examples. They have a very variable pattern here in Sunriver. They're really only found in Sunriver proper, and you don't find them really anywhere else in Central Oregon. You can find them allegedly out towards Burns and a couple of little ponds and reservoirs and such, but otherwise there's just a little population here. Yeah, here's up by Burns, some old populations that I don't think are still around up by the Dalles, and then down in the Klamath Basin, they're probably still around because there's enough waterways down there. All right, questions to ponder. So should we be protecting populations of native species like the western pond turtle in places where they don't naturally occur? What if they're common, rare, threatened, endangered, or even extinct elsewhere? Does it matter? Where do you draw the line? And then second, should an introduced species that isn't spreading or significantly affecting native species be removed by default? Or could it be adding to the local biodiversity and providing unique insight into the ecosystem? That's, I say that as a reference to the tiger salamander because it's not expanding from Sunriver. And so if it was a bait bucket dump, it's not spreading like a bad invasive species such as the bullfrog, but it still could not be a native species and could be causing issues somehow. There's not enough data to know, but just an interesting question to ponder. Any questions?
Where do you send all your bullfrogs to be cooked?
So they come home with me and they're euthanized mainly with a fish sedative. Unfortunately, since we don't have the ability to test every single one to make sure that they're disease free and figure out where they came from, we can't ship them back to the East Coast or do anything like that. We also use benzocaine. It's the same thing that you use on a toothache. That can be used to put them down in a more safe fashion because you don't want to use the fish sedative on bare hands. And then those frogs can go to a local biology teacher that uses them for dissections. Any other questions?
Yeah,
Mhm.
how much are you seeing migration of species down to climate change affecting native species here? And does a new species become an invasive species because it migrated from somewhere else because of climate change? Or is it now a native species because the climate is suited to it here?
That's a very good question. So I'd say it depends. Oftentimes, if let's say it's warming in the Central Oregon area, the pond turtle may be able to go farther upstream and then be invasive in spotted frog habitat, where it's eating the spotted frogs primarily, or something like that, where it becomes an issue. Um, it's I would say they if they are going on their own and they're adapting, then I would consider them native and not invasive. Um, if they're being brought by people to an area that is now habitable, I would consider that invasive if they didn't have a way of reaching that place naturally due to the climate change. Um, but I think a lot of people would have varying opinions on that.
I was going to say that echo at the federal level.
I doubt it.
Thank
Mhm. Yep.
You had a mosaic picture of herps
Mhm.
in this area, are all of those found right here? Or are just a subset of those in Sunriver?
So in Sunriver, you can find the valley garter snake, you can find the Pacific tree frog, you can find the long-toed salamander, you can find the Oregon spotted frog, and you can find the western toad.
What about the tiger?
Yes, so this is the native species, and since the tiger salamander is questionable, I didn't include it on this slide. So the tiger salamander is pretty much only found here in Sunriver, besides the little populations out in Eastern Oregon, Southern Oregon, and Northern Oregon, potentially. Mhm.
I think that's what we have all around our house and like to hide in dark corner. Is there, is there a way to create a special habitat for them so that when they crawl under my mat, I don't step on them?
Good question.
Trying to get away from the heat and
Do you have like a water feature on your property or anything? Okay.
Over across the street from them.
Okay.
So we don't.
So what I would recommend is adding some stone to your landscaping. So something like the local lava rock is really good. It's got those pockets in it, and so they'll crawl underneath. And if they encounter something that they can hide under before they reach your mat, then there's a pretty good likelihood that they'll stop there. And yeah, so they like to stay relatively moist. And so if you have like sprinklers that get close to your front porch, then you may want to adjust them a little bit or something like that to keep them from going up onto the dry porch. But
porch. That's what I know is in the
Yep.
That's the water stream.
yep. Mhm.
For instance, the dots, are they representative of a certain amount of
Nope.
like population? So it could be just a few that they've seen there. Okay.
Yep. So this one, for example, this was out just before Burns, and that spot, there were 2 found in the 80s, and then I believe another 2 or so found a couple years later. And it was just someone happened to find them while they were tilling the ground because they're what's called a mole salamander, along with the long-toed salamanders. So they live underground in tunnels most of the year, and then they really only come out to spawn in the spring. And so when you're moving earth, like one person was moving a berm next to a pond, and they found them in that berm. And the other one, they were tilling along a road and happened to turn some up.
Clearly, it's only what gets reported, so it's
Yep.
really hard.
Yeah, and in Eastern Oregon especially, um, all they need is a little bit of water where they can lay their eggs, and those eggs can hatch and develop into larvae that are large enough to get onto land, which they really need to get about that size. Um, and then they can go off and find a hole, and you won't see them again until they're sexually reproductive adult that's at the spawning pond. Very difficult to study, especially in a dry climate. Yep.
Jesse, would you review the history of bullfrogs in Sunriver?
Sure. So there's records of them from the Gilchrist log pond. I forget what year it was. I want to say it was the 60s. Those are the earliest records for the Sunriver kind of area. It's not Sunriver proper, but we believe that they came down the Little Deschutes from Gilchrist around that time, and their larvae are really good swimmers, and they can go all the way down the Little Deschutes in a matter of weeks, probably. And so with the warm water that we get in the Little Deschutes, they spread pretty quick from that. And then the water in the main Deschutes is pretty cold, especially downstream of Sunriver, where it gets funneled into the canyons and all that. And so they don't tend to do real well. There's a couple of populations that have popped up down there, but they kind of stop just past Sunriver, and then they start popping up again down around Tumalo.
What's the history of them here?
Here, So I don't know when they officially showed up in Sunriver proper. There's been removal since the early 2000s by Jay Bowerman. May have been a little bit earlier than that, actually. But he noticed them, again, I don't remember the year, but he started doing removal, and then um, as more stuff began happening with the spotted frog being listed and that kind of thing, removal started really going a lot stronger, and um, that's when that's when the big deal was made with the bullfrogs in Sunriver.
And they're gone now.
They're not gone. We haven't gotten any in Lake Aspen in the last 5 or 6 years, I believe. Well, I think we got one last year, but it was a transient bullfrog that had hopped over from the river. And so they haven't been reproducing in Lake Aspen here in the last 5 years. There's been some that kind of hop over from the Deschutes on the golf course, because there's about a 300-foot span from the Deschutes to the golf course ponds. And so on a rainy night in the summer, they can hop that distance pretty quick. And they're all throughout the little Deschutes. And so there's a constant flow of larvae kind of flowing down into the Deschutes. And then as they transform, they either stick along the river or they'll venture out looking for ponds. So it's an ongoing battle that there's no real good way of ending right now.
You talked about the influence of the Deschutes, the little Deschutes, wake up,
Mhm.
breeding ground. You haven't mentioned Fall River, we're in Three Rivers area.
Mhm.
Is it just too short and too cold?
Yep. Yeah, so bullfrogs need water that's at least 70 degrees Fahrenheit to be able to spawn. And so anything that doesn't reach that warm, they're just not really gonna venture in too much. You might get a few at the mouth of it as they're going up looking for food, but then they'll go back to the warmer water. And on the subject of temperature, a fun fact about the spotted frog, in the winter, when water temperatures drop below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, they can absorb enough oxygen through their skin to stay submerged for as long as they need. And so they'll stay underwater for the entire winter, just hanging out underneath the ice, breathing through their skin. And then if they feel like they need to catch their breath, then they'll go up to the very thin layer of really cold water at the bottom of the ice, because colder water holds more dissolved oxygen, and they can kind of catch their breath and then go back down into the bottom. Any other questions? Yep.
Well, so if we find bullfrogs on the property, we call you.
Sure, that works. You can call me, you can call the Nature Center. You can post them on apps like iNaturalist. iNaturalist posts the location of stuff like bullfrogs. As an observation, you'd need a photo or a recording of the call. Bullfrogs have kind of a sound, what they're called. They're not like the ribbit that you get with the tree frogs. So yeah. And then the spotted frogs are a click. It's like a very quiet. You have to be right up next to them to hear them.
So it's the tree frogs that we hear at night then when it's just really loud.
Yep. Here, I can pull up a recording of the bullfrogs.
It's like an invasive.
So bullfrogs. So that's what a bullfrog sounds like. That's a bunch of them. Mhm. Mhm. All right. Any other questions? All right, then I'm going to hand it back over to Katie.
Thanks, Jesse.
Mhm. Oh, that's right. Forgot I was going to show you guys. Okay. So this is a tiger salamander. They're quite large.
Hey, bud.
Well fed.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Eating good.
Mm.
Yeah.
Is that an adult?
Yep. Yeah, this is an adult male.
That could probably be okay.
Thanks.
Is that the same kind of higher salamander we have here?
Yep.
Yeah. No, I mean, like the one who live around, like the one, this is that's the same kind of higher salamander.
This is a bullfrog.
Hey, can you speak
So this is a pretty small adult male.
Very cool.
Gigantic eyes.
Oh, yeah. He's looking at you with the fly in your face. Yeah, what's the?
Called the ilium. So that's just kind of his hips.
Okay. Specific to this species or?
Most frogs
Most
have it.
so it's not a cage.
Yep. Yeah, most frogs will have that kind of hunch. This guy's a little bit on the thin side, so they're more pronounced, but typically you'll have that kind of hunch shape on the back.
I don't think you're putting any weight on that.
All right. I know exactly what. This is an expert frog catcher.
Yeah, if I can't catch you in a classroom, I should probably retire.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, he's fine.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Guys for joining us. We have the Twilight talk next month. We focus on notes in our horticultural department. Right? Okay, I'm not next time. All right. No, it'll be the third Thursday though. So same time, same place. There'll be snacks. And yeah, feel free to stick around. If you're interested in the yellow rail stuff, that's going to begin at about 6 o'clock right here. So thank you all for joining.
I don't know if they're all.
There will also be a recording of this on our YouTube channel in the near future as well, if you wanted to revisit it.